Yeah, so our first story for tonight, we want to talk about a possible meat tax that's been, the possibility has been going around over the world, really, even in Europe, because we already tax things that we use day to day, like gas, buying sugary drinks, cigarettes. Now weed is taxed. And there's been studies that have been done that highlight the benefits of a tax on meat. So there's research that suggests that a tax on red meat could prevent more than 220,000 deaths and save over $40 billion in healthcare costs every year. And this was done by the Oxford Martin program on the future of food. So there's been studies done on this that could have a lot of positive outcomes if this were to succeed. But there's a lot of legitimate concerns about, the meat is something that people buy every day, so putting a tax on that would just be burdensome on working class people that, go to the store and buy these products. But that's true, but with this tax on meat, we would want to accompany it with, let's lower the price on things that need to be subsidized, like fruits and vegetables, because that isn't subsidized. But yet the number one thing that's killing people, which is meat and dairy, those are the things that get subsidized in America, but not the things that could save people's lives and improve people's health and the environment. So, guys, what do you think? Robert, meat tax or no meat tax?
Yeah, I think the meat tax is a complicated issue. I think from like a public relations standpoint, a meat tax that actually is on suppliers and producers might work in tandem with like a consumer tax. So like in this case, it would be saying like the way it could be positioned is no more corporate welfare.
Right.
So people generally perceive corporate welfare as very negative. Like libertarians, progressives, people across the political spectrum think corporate handouts and corporate welfare is a bad thing. And so from a public perception standpoint, we might get more people leverage behind a tax that actually tax suppliers and producers to a certain extent in tandem with like taxing consumers. So that's one of the thoughts I had too. And then the other important point I think in considering the meat tax is also considering subsidies in tandem with that, because according to a friend of mine who works at, she's a lobbyist for the Agricultural Fairness Alliance. And what they're trying to do is actually get all animal agriculture subsidies repealed. And she says that there's $38 billion in subsidies to animal agriculture, and this does not include anything that would cover environmental damage. It does not include disaster relief. It does not include extra payouts that we've seen Trump announce, like billions of dollars because of the effects of the trade wars. Like those are all additional billions. So she thinks strongly that subsidies have to be part of the discussion about a tax, because if a farmer gets taxed and then gets a kickback via a subsidy or a break on an insurance policy, then it becomes a wash. So we just have to make sure that we factor in like the subsidy system as well when we're talking about the meat tax.
That's where I would have wanted to start also, is like there are a lot of subsidies on factory farms and big ag that can be removed that effectively kind of get rid of that incentive to continue the meat production as it is today. And if that's the overall goal, right? Reduce meat production, influence Americans' diets, help people be healthier, we can do that with financial incentives. And things like value-added taxes or a sin tax, something like a tax that's on cigarettes or on alcohol, if you were to apply that to meat, as a socialist-minded, political observer, I have problems with that because you begin putting the onus on individuals, even though it's meant to dissuade the use or the consumption of meat. It's still a regressive tax structure.
Right.
So, and the same argument can be made for additional taxes on producers, although somewhat to a lesser extent, because ultimately what people will argue is, well, more taxes on the production side will lead to increased costs on the consumer side, which I think is fine. Ultimately, that accomplishes the same goal of disincentivizing meat as a primary means of sustenance. So, I mean, it is very much using financial levers to influence public habit, but I think attacking it from the subsidy angle first, and then from a production side tax angle, and then as a last resort, some sort of sin tax or value-added tax on the actual product. I would never hope that the beginning would be, hey, let's start by taxing the common person. But
Yeah.
ultimately, this is attempting to influence societal norms via economic incentives, which is
Right.
a pretty tried and true method, all things considered. So
Yeah.
I'm in general in favor of it. I don't know if we've seen a lot of push policy-wise for something like this in the United States. Eric, you mentioned earlier that there's a lot of conversation around this, particularly in Europe. This is the type of policy that has generated a lot of conversation, and there's a lot of thought behind it. But it really I haven't noticed much traction on it. And so what do we think it takes to put this in legislators' platform proposals? What does it take to influence policymakers to say, hey, this is something that we could reasonably do, and it is popular?
Well, I think, the number one thing is you got to get people for a policy in order for it to get anywhere. So when people know that, if you just say we're going to tax meat, people are not going to be for it. Like, because one, they don't know where the money is going, where it's going to be doing, and they just look at it as like another, increase on things that they buy all the time. But
Right.
if you link it to, oh well, if we tax this, it's going to go towards
Healthcare.
healthcare
expenses or
yeah,
covering
reduce healthcare
healthcare,
expenses
maybe.
because America, is the richest country in the world. This spends the most on healthcare, gets the shittiest results, and our
Right.
the number one killers are heart disease and cancers, which are caused by meat and dairy, and that's why our healthcare. That's why it's so expensive. But that's one of the reasons why. If we link it to something like
some
that,
benefit.
some
like,
benefit,
Yeah, some societal benefit.
like that,
then-
or we'll put the funds toward getting animal ag farms or the ag industry into more of a plant-based industry. Like
Yeah.
we'll start training farmers to be veganic farmers,
Right.
or something.
Which is part of Laura's initiative. The Agricultural Fairness Alliance is an initiative to try to get farmers to transition and to reward them for transitioning from animal farming to plant crops. The other thing I wanted to Paul's point, I think we have to recognize, just how powerful the meat industry is and animal agriculture is, and how much they spend on promoting the consumption of animal products. If they have billions of dollars to spend on pushing animal products down our throats, literally
Right.
like on TV, on the internet, wherever we socially interact, then if they're gonna, the other thing could be add rules that are much stricter. Because if we look at the tobacco industry, and how this is very similar to how the tobacco industry evolved in this country. When the market declined here because the regulators started cracking down on tobacco industry, they sought export markets. And so we have to look at what happened with tobacco and say they're going to try the same thing. But we could try some of those same strategies that caused them to decline here, which would be like stricter rules on advertising, cutting their subsidies, stuff like that. So Yeah, the advertising is so huge and it's so subliminal. We don't even recognize, what's going on half the time.
Yeah, and I think it's important for people to realize that the crops that are being produced go toward most of them go to animals that we then kill needlessly
I was
for
just going
pleasure.
to make that point.
Right. Yeah, and if we stopped that, like a meat tax could help stop those crops going toward animals to being raised to be killed for pleasure, for sensory pleasure, instead of, and then have that be made available for us to eat.
Right.
For
A lot of
people.
those subsidies are for corn specifically, which
Yeah,
I think it needs
corn
to be
and
pointed
soy.
out that this kind of over-reliance on corn, both in the American diet and, of course, in the diet of the animals that we are
Which
feeding
they're
with
not
the
even
corn.
supposed to be eating.
Right. It's not exactly the best food for most animals. That all comes with subsidies, right? It's back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the financial incentives that you can put there. If we remove some of these incentives for farmers to grow corn specifically for feed, then we effectively increase the costs as well for the meat producing farmers without having to do value-added taxes or sin taxes on the
Right.
consumer. Yeah.
Exactly. And then, the farmers will make the case that their costs are so much higher, and then consumers will say, well, if their costs are higher, then I guess that means we're going to have to pay higher costs too, because that's just how the system is working.
Yeah. Makes
Yeah.
that spinach salad look a lot
somebody-
more appealing.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Because right now we're bearing the cost of the environmental and health costs, not
Yeah.
the farming industry. For the most part, the consumers the little people are actually bearing the brunt of environmental and healthcare costs that have spiraled out of control, largely because of this industry. So they've deferred those costs onto us, and that's got to change. I mean, that's not a just system at all.
And yet that's how most systems like this work is how do we put the cost on the little guy? How do we spread out the cost into a bunch of little nickel and dimes that we can put on everyone else and make sure that it doesn't touch my giant hoard
Right.
of cash over here because I got to keep what's mine, all for me and nothing for anyone else.
Yeah.
That's like the ethos of the American capitalist.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. It's
That's definitely
very
right.
awful.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of value that this would produce, I think.
Okay.
Yeah,
So-
I think it's the direction we should go in.
Yeah.
I think it's a step in the right direction. Yeah, it's a little step.
I mean,
of course.
there's bits of minutia. There are different ways
Yeah.
it could be done. We can talk about moving the levers here, there, wherever, but doing nothing is doing nothing,
Yeah.
and this is something, and it could get the kind of results that would be very healthy and beneficial for citizens the world over.
Yeah, we're typically not for reforms or for overthrowing the system. The capitalist system is the disease. These are just the symptoms of the disease. Socialism is the cure to this disease. So that's what we advocate for. But I think this is a step in the right direction.